Descends. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Frontline Club again. When we have these salons, we are talking about reporting from abroad, those sorts of questions. But I think at the root of those questions is often a question about power and how power is formed, how power is utilized, and where power resides. And those are the topics I think that we want to discuss today with, I'm delighted to say, Anushka Asthana. Anushka needs little introduction. Most of us are familiar with her from our TV screens and her political reporting before that. She started out as a general reporter for The Observer, and you've worked for The Washington Post. You were a political correspondent for The Times. You worked for Sky News. In 2015, you were appointed the joint political editor of The Guardian. You are now the deputy political editor of ITV News. So it's no wonder then that Anushka was in the perfect position to write her recently published and critically acclaimed book, Taken as Read: How Labour Won Big and the Tories Crashed the Party. After all these years with access to some of the leading political figures, you've had these experiences at the beating heart of Westminster, the limp lettuce of the edges of Westminster, but it's a kind of, the book is an insider's take on the workings of power in the country.
Yeah.
And I think we should we'll be talking about power, we'll be talking about politics, we'll be talking about some of the personalities, and how some people have got the personalities of the people in charge, such as Keir Starmer, wrong. But first, Anushka Asthana, welcome to the Frontline Club.
Thank you.
So, the great thing about reading a book on PDF, when they send you the book to read, is that you can actually Google terms.
Oh, yeah.
Right? You can actually search. And one of the words I searched for, because I was thinking about this, I'm like, well, you work in Westminster, you spend a lot of time in Westminster, you write about politics in the UK at a time when we've had Boris Johnson, Brexit, Liz Truss, and yet the word weird never appears. Isn't that strange? Like, you've got all these archaic rituals inside Westminster, some of these archaic people inside Westminster, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and yet the word weird doesn't appear.
Well, it's not for me to have an opinion on what's going on. I just said it out. I mean, if you read it and you think it's weird, then I've probably described it quite well. But it's very important, particularly in my role at the moment, that I'm not telling you whether someone's weird or not, but I can tell you that plenty about Westminster is weird.
It is weird, right? There are these odd rituals. There is a thing about the place. I mean, you spend a lot of time there.
Yes, I mean, I've been in the lobby now for 15 years.
Wow.
The political lobby, which is the journalists who've got an office inside Parliament, and I still don't know my way around.
Really?
And I still get confused as to when I'm allowed to walk into the members' lobby to speak to MPs and when I'm not allowed to do that. I'm still not completely with it in terms of the legislative process, the way that whipping happens and takes part. I mean, of course, I understand it way better than your average person, but I still find it all, quite an odd place, because so much of it is like steeped in the history of it.
Right.
And they've tried to keep those traditions while moving into a kind of more modern society. In fact, I remember was I 8.5 months pregnant, and I was standing in members' lobby and I sat down and they were like, oh, you're not allowed to sit there. And I was like, I'm really pregnant. They were like, you're still not allowed to sit there. You might have to go into the next place, because only members are allowed to sit there.
And do you think that impacts the way the country is run? Because in order to, you have this new intake every now and again. Now we've had a whole bunch of new MPs joining. And it takes them time to get used to what's happening.
Oh, yeah.
So there's an inbuilt advantage for those people who've been in Parliament for a very long time, who have, they're not necessarily hereditary peers, but sometimes they've inherited their political power from their families.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really difficult. All these new MPs, and this 2024 was the most sort of mind-blowing turnaround that we'd seen. I was there in 2010 when the Tories came in, and there was quite a few new people, but this time, I mean, literally was there like 200 new Labour MPs, something crazy, and it's quite confusing. They were all sitting in Portcullis House because they didn't have an office, and then they had to get an office. Then, quite a lot of them are very young this time, and they're trying to work out how we're going to live in two places and move between them. Where's my family going to be? How does this voting system work? How am I going to get on a select committee? I think it is quite baffling. And actually I was with someone today who's the person in the Labour Party who kind of looks after all the new MPs, and was saying they were thinking about introducing a mentoring system to try and help them through the process.
It seems to take a very long time for some of these things to happen. You remember Stella Creasy was talking about this, that a lot of the late night sittings are very detrimental for women who have children and things like that. It's very, very hard. It's taken so much time. We're in 2024 and still none of those things have happened.
Yeah, no, it is true because of the late night sittings, you also have bars in Parliament. So a lot of the kind of meetings and access is done, or traditionally done, over a pint in the bar. But what if you're, got a young family, you want to go home to your family, you want to try and do other stuff, you don't want to drink all the time, it becomes a more difficult place. And I think over the years, women have tried to build up the networks to compare to the men's networks to try and give them that advantage. And it has changed. It's very different from when I first joined it, but definitely it is not a normal workplace.
That is something that comes out in your book. I mean, the kind of, not just the cliques, although that is very real, but also the way that power moves very informally. And I think it's something that we'll come back to a lot in this conversation, that most of the way that decisions are made is very informal. It's not really like they have a committee and they come to a decision, okay, that's what we're going to do. It's they have a little chat in somebody's room, they have a drink in the bar, and they said, okay, let's give weapons to Ukraine or whatever it is.
I mean, I think it's a bit more formal than that. I think so, in terms of the departmental kind of structures and how they would make a decision like that. I do think it is more formal than that. But I do think you're right to say that there are probably a small number of people in each department who have quite a lot of power. And if they do decide something, then they can make it happen however they want. And I've seen loads of different styles. So there are some ministers who are incredibly professional.
Yeah.
And then, like when all the stuff came out about Dominic Raab apparently being a bully, being quite weird with his staff. I mean, normally civil servants are really nervous to get in touch with you, but suddenly my DMs were completely full of civil servants who were like, yeah, he was like this, he was like that, it was really unprofessional. And so I think you get a real kind of spread of types of minister.
About the Raab stuff, I mean, it's just an example of it. Sometimes these stories, when they come out like a flood. People already know what's happening. They just don't tell you about it, or they tell you about it, but you can't quite report it at that point. And then something happens, like he lost the confidence, I think, of the Prime Minister. And then suddenly these stories come out.
I think it did. For me, it all came out as a flood. Like as soon as one person had been brave enough to speak, other people started to get in touch. I think I think what maybe you could get at is that there are kind of well-kept secrets, if you like, or kind of open secrets, which is, and especially historically, this MP is a bit handsy, for example, and people can't stand it up. The reason we can't report it is usually because it's not reached a legal bar.
Right.
And then something happens that then encourages more people to come forward.
That's what happened with Chris Pincher.
Yeah, that's what happened with Chris Pincher.
Right.
I think there were rumours that terrible things were going on, but nobody had managed to get it to that point.
Until there was that.
I mean, I had tried actually on Chris Pincher, and we'd never got to a legal bar to get it over the line.
Well, let's talk a bit about how power works close up. And the example I wanted to talk about was what I think is the most impactful decision a government has made in our lifetimes, which is COVID, the COVID lockdowns. And you have this whole chapter dedicated to COVID. And one of the things I found interesting about it was that it's so personality driven, at least the way you tell the story. But the way you tell the story, I think, is a reflection of really what was going on. With Boris Johnson, who was then the Prime Minister, Michael Gove, Rishi Sunak, all these figures pulling in different directions. And it was interesting to me because when you're trying to understand how power works, sometimes you're amazed that even something like that, which is very scientific, very data-led, still ultimately came down to the push and pull of these personalities.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, actually what the scientists were advising the government at the time, at the start of COVID, and I often think Boris gets a lot of blame, rightly so, for what went wrong at the beginning of COVID. But they were following the advice they were being given by scientists. And the advice they were being given by scientists was wrong at the beginning. And part of the reason it was wrong was the fault of ministers, because the plans that they had made for this sort of crisis was so far out of date. I mean, the last plan they had made was a flu crisis in 2011. Just one small thing, like Zoom didn't exist in 2011. If you're thinking about having a policy where people are going to stay at home, and nowadays people can work from home because we have an incredible array of ways to stay in touch, to have meetings, how can you have a plan for that was done 8 years ago when these things didn't exist. I
mean, on a completely different disease.
Yeah, which, by the way, is the fault of politicians. But the one thing I would say is they were trying to follow the scientific advice. The scientific advice, at the beginning at least, was incorrect because it was based on this flu idea, and then they quickly then started to wake up to the severity of it and the nature of it, and that changed things. One of the things that I really think went wrong with COVID is we have a system of government where the Secretary of State in each department is all-powerful.
Right.
And then you have a Prime Minister, and every day maybe 2 or 3 things need to get up to the Prime Minister, and so they make a decision on 2 or 3 things. Suddenly with COVID, we didn't have a system in place for a minister who was in charge of it. So suddenly every decision was going to the Prime Minister, to number 10, and number 10 wasn't set up to deal with it. And they had all these competing demands from different departments. I mean, I think there is one scene I described where they're sitting in a room and they're trying to decide about the lockdown, and Rishi Sunak says, we can't close pubs and bars because of the economic consequences of it. And Matt Hancock, who was then Health Secretary, was saying, we have to close all bars and pubs, otherwise they're going to be a vector for the disease. And I say a senior figure, but actually apparently it was Boris Johnson, said, how about we just close them, we leave them open, but we tell everyone not to go to them.
Right.
And
before, if you didn't know it was Boris Johnson, you would guess that was Boris Johnson, right?
Yeah. But the point being, it was like a completely crazy situation.
Right.
The massive failure was we hadn't got our resilience ready, and we hadn't done an up-to-date plan, and also the structure of government wasn't ready for it. So when they actually put a minister in charge of one important thing, which was the vaccine programme, Nadeem Zahawi, it actually worked very well, and they did very well as a result of it.
But the personality aspect does make a difference, because you're right. So if you're thinking about the Prime Minister and taking these decisions every day, okay, 3 decisions go up to the Prime Minister. Even were the bottleneck to be a competent Prime Minister and not Boris, not a fan, that it would still be problematic. But the fact that you had someone who couldn't take decisions easily multiplied the consequences, right?
Yeah, and I think what is it, Dominic Cummings, who describes him as a trolley. I think from talking to people about him, there is some truth to this idea that they were veering from left to right.
Right.
And I don't know if I have sympathy or not. I mean, it was a crisis like no one could have ever imagined coming at them. The scientific advice was confusing. I mean, I think one of the first things we did wrong was not actually realise that what was going on in China was very serious. And even when Italy was locking down, they were saying, our scientists don't think we're not going to have to lock down, that's ridiculous. And it just suddenly came at us. I mean, in terms of Boris Johnson, I just think he's a particular type of character, and he's sort of like very much chairman rather than CEO, very much like not the details guy. He's the guy who wants to sit there and think big picture and, talk a certain way. And actually the politics, in a way, really hit a sweet spot, which was he was pro-Brexit, obviously, because of where he come from, but he was also pro-levelling up, which obviously it ended up being too much of a slogan and not a reality. But the idea of it was a good one.
Right.
And the idea of it, if he had been able to deliver it, would have been, really powerful. But Boris was like a boosterish kind of guy. He wanted to talk about it, but he thought he had 10 years in power. So instead of actually getting on with levelling up, and this is what people close to him said to me, he thought, we can bring thinkers in, we can take our time, we can make this work. Didn't have 10 years, didn't even have 5 years. And I think that is the speed at which things are now changing in politics.
I mean, we'll come to some of that, and I don't want it to seem as if I'm taking shots at Boris, because I'm interested in talking about the way that power is constructed. But I do find it interesting that the personality at the very top has such a disproportionate impact on the way that politics is conducted. Because the administration, you've been through a bunch of these administrations.
Yeah.
The Boris one is very different to the Rishi one.
Yeah.
The Rishi one is very different to the Liz one, the very brief Liz one. I imagine now the Keir Starmer one is completely different, right?
Yeah, so Liz Truss was described to me by the people closest to her, and including the then Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng spoke to me on the record about this. He basically said to me, she'd have been gone in 6 months, whatever happened. You can blame a load of other things. You can blame the LDI crisis for what kind of eventually brought her down, maybe. I mean, and I do actually think it is true that the crisis in pensions no one had warned the government about it. It probably was one of the reasons that the mini budget led to where you were. But he said she would have been gone anyway because of her personality. And he actually said it's the psychology of the leader.
Yeah.
And he said she was in such a rush. And he said to her, if you do this, Liz, you're only going to have 2 months. Oh, no, so she said, sorry, I've only got 2 years as Prime Minister. I've got to go fast.
Right.
She wanted to do everything yesterday.
Right.
And he said, if you do this, you'll only have 2 months, which was proven to be correct. And someone else very, very close to Liz Truss said to me, she also tried to work in silos. So she got rid of the morning meeting where all the different people would come together and talk to each other. And she would talk to people about the economics, or she'd talk to people about health, or she'd talk to people about levelling up or whatever the other policy might be. And the people who were in the health area didn't think they knew about the economics, etc. And the problem with that was it was a breakdown of communication, and really driven by her leadership, that led to the kind of chaotic
crisis.
situation. And it is interesting that no one close to her comes out thinking she was amazing and wronged. Most of them were really critical of her when I spoke to them. And then Rishi was much more a technocrat, a guy who can get things done, incredibly hardworking. Most of the people who worked with him, and look, politically a lot of people might disagree with this, but most of those who worked with him thought he was a really decent, hardworking guy. But one of the people really close to him said to me, he didn't think that Rishi could have ever won the next election, because to win the next election, Rishi had to not be Rishi.
Right.
And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, we were facing 14 years of emotion and anger and fury. And to turn that tide, you needed something big and emotive. And Rishi wasn't a big and emotive guy.
No.
He was the guy who had 5 tests and was going to try and fix things one by one. And so to this person who's very close to Rishi Sunak, there was never any chance.
Do you think that do you think that if you survey the personalities that you've encountered, I was compiling a list somewhere of the people that all of us know. You've met Clinton. Not Clinton. Yeah, you've met Clinton, I think you told me.
No, I've met
you've met Obama.
Obama.
Cameron. Yeah. But you've met some of these figures.
Yeah.
Do you think that we are now in a place where we have more technocrats, Boris aside? Like, we just don't seem to have such...
Well, it is definitely true that Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak are more technocratic.
Liz Truss, Theresa May.
I don't know if I would have called Liz Truss technocratic.
Maybe not technocratic, yeah. But I mean, she's a smaller figure than Boris, than David Cameron, than Blair.
Well, people want, I was watching, Boris Johnson came into ITN the other day to do an interview with my colleague Tom Bradby on his book that he mentioned about 60 times. And I haven't even mentioned mine once. And he, I did sit watching it because I was cutting it down for the evening news bulletin. And I thought, God, he is kind of impressive as a kind of charismatic individual. And we really do miss that, I think, when we don't have it. And every time it happens that we have someone less charismatic, so when Gordon Brown followed Tony Blair, everyone said it was brilliant. The end of spin, what was it? Less Flash, more Gordon. But in reality,
that was a while ago.
But in reality, I think people respond to spin and they respond to personality. And, Nigel Farage is really popular with a really big and important part of the electorate because he's got a load of personality and he can bring a room to life. And I think that, that it will be quite interesting if Kemi Badenoch wins the Conservative leadership. There's plenty of things that could go wrong with her, and she has said some wild things in this race. And ideologically, I think she's in an interesting place. But she's definitely got more personality than Keir Starmer, and I'm really interested in what that will feel like across the dispatch box.
If you think about the politicians that you know, I mean, the 650, there's a lot of them.
I don't know all 650.
No, well, that's part of the difficulty, right? But this is kind of where I'm going with it, that you don't meet most of them. They start to bubble up. That's when you start to notice them, right? Because you're dealing with them.
Yeah, but also you might decide you're going to meet people in certain areas. So, for example, I went and had my 3rd child in 2018. And so when I came back, 2019, I was just back for the election and suddenly there were all these new MPs. So I emailed every single Conservative who'd won in a red wall seat, which was 60 or something. And then everyone that replied to me about coffee, I went and had coffee with. Or you might decide, the woman who runs the Labour Women's Network, I said to her, give me your 10 favourite new women. Right. And I emailed them. Or I said to someone today who I know is quite in Team Keir Starmer, okay, who are the kind of next 15 junior ministers? Right. And so
the people at the back in the picture.
Yeah, or you might say, look, I need to know people in Scotland, so I'm going to choose a few Scottish MPs. So I try and be systematic about it. What I used to do is, if they're on select committees that I'm interested in, then I try and meet them, or if they might run an all-party parliamentary group that I'm interested in.
But I think where I was going with it is, when you meet a lot of these characters, let's say people like Boris and Nigel Farage and Blair, they have charisma. Let's say it in a neutral sense. You don't have to like them, like their politics, but they have a certain charisma about them. When you encounter those people at a lower level before they become that powerful, do they still have that charisma? Or does the office give them some of the charisma?
Well, I think it is a little bit of both. Take David Cameron. I think when he was he became leader of the Conservative Party in 2005, and apparently there was a dinner at one of the conferences on 2008 or 9 with all the News International bosses. So all, the Times, the Sun, the Sunday Times, and apparently they were laughing their head off at this David Cameron because he was so lightweight, and they just couldn't believe that he had any chance to become Prime Minister. And then he became Prime Minister, and I don't think David Cameron's got bags of personality, but he had authority, probably. You probably saw him as a Prime Minister. You didn't think he looked,
It's not unreasonable to say he had a certain charisma.
Yeah, so I think some people like him, but A, grow into it, and B, the role pushes you into it. But then there are some people who've just got charisma. And I think, Boris Johnson just has charisma and has always had it. And he was interesting when he was a backbench MP. He was interesting when he was London Mayor. He was interesting when he ran for Brexit. I mean, loved and hated. I mean, I did a LBC last week and I did an hour on Boris, and literally every call would be, I love him. And then the next call would be, I absolutely want to kill him. And it was so divisive that in the end, it was too much for the British public.
But are there, without naming names necessarily, or you can name names, but are there people that you have encountered at a lower level now who are currently MPs who you think that person's got something?
Yeah, and do you know what? I think there are actually quite a few quite interesting, charismatic people who've already got a bit of a, profile in their own areas in this government, because so many people won new MPs on the Labour side, and the way the selections had been done by the Labour Party, they had picked some quite high-profile people. Take Torsten Bell, who was already the director of the Resolution Foundation, or there was a pollster, Chris Curtis. I mean, I'm not going to think of good people here, but there was loads of people who already had a bit of a profile, and
they brought them in now.
MPs,
I wanted to go back to how power works, but I wanted to think about it in the context of foreign policy. And one of the things that always struck me about Ukraine and the war in Ukraine was how ill-informed the people making the decisions were. That this crisis happens, the Russians invade, and suddenly you have to react to it about a country most people had barely heard of, about a context that most people didn't know about. With Boris Johnson, again, this isn't an anti-Boris Johnson thing, just for those Tories in the room, Tory Central Council, that you talk about Boris Johnson taking this leading role. Did he take a leading role because he genuinely thought the Russians were a threat to the whole of the continent? Or do you think, as I think, that essentially he saw an opportunity to emulate his hero Churchill?
I'm sure there's a bit of that, and if you haven't read it, his book on Churchill is quite interesting. Although I actually said this once to Boris Johnson, I think he's supposed to be kind of hero-loving Churchill, but the book made me think a lot less of Churchill.
Well, he didn't write it, I imagine.
Maybe not. Well, I don't know, he is quite a good writer. Look, I think that was him in his element. I think there probably was a belief in sticking up for Ukraine over Russia, but I think there was also this kind of natural personal relationship between himself and Zelensky, which really helped him to create a bond that allowed him to look like he was leading the way. Remember also, it came at a point where he nearly got kicked out, right? So in December, January, the Partygate scandal was at its peak. In January, I was speaking to people who went on to be, Tory MPs who went on to be big Boris supporters, who were saying it's time for a managed exit. And I detailed in quite a lot of detail how this process happened. They were putting in letters of no confidence in Boris Johnson, and there was this whole kind of shadow whipping operation that they started to run to persuade MPs to take their letters out. Very successful, actually, and quite an interesting idea about how you need to work on the hearts and minds of MPs. And then in comes Ukraine, and an opportunity for him to both look prime ministerial and use his ability to create that bond with Zelensky to turn the corner. And actually, even weeks later, MPs were saying to me, I've changed my mind, I think he should stay now.
You say this in the book,
Yeah.
that a lot of MPs just said, you know what, it's important to have a figure like that. And suddenly the war over there changed the way people felt about him here.
And we all thought he was going to survive then. And if it wasn't for the Chris Pincher scandal, he may well have done.
The very fact that he goes to Ukraine, he meets Zelensky, and they have a good relationship, doesn't that tell you something about the way personalities are impacted by, how power is impacted by personalities? Because he could have had a bad relationship with Zelensky, and that might have altered the way the West has responded to Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely...
Isn't it interesting that it's so narrow?
I definitely do think that the personalities there made a big difference. But I don't think... I think the hostility to Russia would have been the same either way, because I think that was sort of baked into the government's view. It was where America was. I don't think we were going to split from America on the issue of Ukraine. Ukraine was seen as part of Europe and a country that we wanted to bring closer in. You know, so I don't think it would have changed that, but I do think you're right that the personality and the relationship probably did impact the amount that we personally intervened.
That's why it's so interesting, I think, because, I mean, you know, we say that there's always the background political, geopolitical reasons for why these things happen. But I mean, when it happened in Crimea in 2014, nobody paid any attention. So it's entirely possible that something could have happened similarly, maybe on a smaller scale in Donetsk, for example. But you can imagine a scenario where the West doesn't pay that much attention in 2022, and Putin is allowed to take part of it. So the interesting part to me is that you have these personalities, and the impact of the specific personalities have this, they have this enormous change in the way that all of us have experienced it and the way the Ukrainians have experienced it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I absolutely think you're right that impacted hugely the way that we dealt with it. I wonder if because 2014 had happened and it had continued beyond that was one of the reasons that we reacted in the way that we had done. But it is interesting how we treat different wars around the world in completely different ways.
Which brings us, thank you for that, brings us to Gaza. And what seems to me a genuinely chaotic response from Starmer over the period when he was opposition leader and now as Prime Minister. We've talked about this before, and you've suggested that Starmer got the politics of Gaza wrong.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, so the reason he did this, and I've got to be kind of careful in my language here because you just got to, I don't want to kind of overstate the reason, but remember that under Jeremy Corbyn, Labour had hugely lost the trust of the Jewish community, hugely. And Keir Starmer, when he came in, rebuilding that trust was seen as something that was absolutely critical. And so at the moment, and obviously for a lot of Jewish people, the relationship with Israel is, hugely entwined, and you can't kind of completely separate Israel to a lot of Jewish people in this country to their own Judaism. And when in that moment of darkness for Israel, Keir Starmer's instinct was, I need to do everything I can to show the Jewish community that we are on their side. And so he obviously, rightly, he condemned what had happened hugely. But then he went further in an LBC interview, which was a disaster for the Labour Party and remains a disaster for the Labour Party. And he said, as I'm sure a lot of you will remember, in response to Nick Ferrari saying, is it okay for Israel to withhold food and water? He said that it was okay for Israel to do that. He tried to argue afterwards that that isn't what he meant, but you listen to the interview, it's really clear. Keir Starmer basically says it is okay to do that.
The barrister Keir Starmer?
The barrister perhaps, perhaps he was, although, part of me thinks the barrister Keir Starmer should more so not have said that.
Right, that's my point.
Yeah.
That after that interview, people have said, well, it was the crisis was coming at him. He may have misspoken. He was a barrister. Yeah. He was a lawyer.
I see what you
He's
mean,
trying to be Prime Minister.
And it was a point about international law.
Right,
I mean, we know. And he then went on to say in the same answer, but they can't breach international law, knowing full well that withholding food and water is a breach of international law. Anyway,
but you talked about this
royally.
Yeah.
And then they don't say anything for 9 days. They don't say anything for 9 days when support in communities all over the country, and not just Muslim communities, lots of other people, lots of white people, lots of people of different ethnicities, was collapsing, was literally collapsing. And it took them 9 days to say anything. And actually in that period, I think it was actually in the 9 days. I think it possibly was. I was making a documentary with Keir Starmer, and I was doing this thing where I was walking up to the Emirates with him because he was going off to watch the football, and it was all meant to be a sort of like more behind the scenes, what's he like type of documentary. But
the Emirates Stadium as opposed to the...
Oh yeah, sorry, the Emirates Stadium, yeah.
Nation.
Although there was a moment where I also saw him in Dubai and another part of the same documentary. But he basically, I was like, I'm not going to not ask you about Gaza at this moment. So I really grilled him on Gaza, which he was, I could tell, pissed off about, because he was struggling with what have I done and how am I going to deal with this. And I think what he understood and realised quite quickly is the Middle East crisis is so complicated and so difficult, and the idea that you have to be careful in everything that you say when you're talking about it. And I don't know why he misunderstood that earlier, but I could tell at this point he was grappling with how on earth do I deal with this. I mean, I used to work at The Guardian, and covering these issues, really difficult. Like, let's be honest, it's not an easy thing to try and talk about and understand what's the right thing to say. But they left it for 9 days. And then they said something which was a bit better, but it wasn't enough to really soothe the way that people were feeling.
You call this that's your coinage, the loss of the fourth red wall.
Yeah, I call it the loss of the fourth red wall, because I didn't think it was only about Gaza. You know, what happened in the election was there was a dramatic drop in support among Muslim voters for Labour, which, as you well know, cost them actual seats in 5 parts of the country. And probably stopped them from winning Dewsbury, and definitely stopped them from winning Dewsbury. And I went to Birmingham to try and understand this a bit better, and one thing I would say is it wasn't just about Gaza. It wasn't about Gaza. These are basically communities who are living in urban areas, who are low income, who have been very badly hit by austerity, who have voted Labour their entire lives, locally and nationally, and whose lives are really difficult, and who have had a tough time, and who were as ready to raise the 2-child benefit cap with me as they were Gaza. And I think Gaza came into the mix, and it kind of turbo boosted anger that was already there with Labour, and it caused an electoral disaster for them, but one that wasn't big enough in 2024 to stop the overall picture, but is a huge problem for them going forward. And the reason I call it a fourth red wall is that is exactly what happened with white working class voters. They had voted Labour their whole lives, and they felt let down. It's exactly what happened in Scotland in 2015, and it's exactly what happened in Barking and Dagenham in 2006 when people voted for the BNP. And you can break this down any way you want, but it is the same response, which is we keep voting for you and our lives are not getting better. And so if Labour wants to regain that support, and I think it's right that they shouldn't automatically get Muslims to vote for them, or Indians, or or Hindus, or whatever group. It's right. It shouldn't be automatic. It's a good thing that people are choosing to vote the way they want to. Yeah. But there's a massive trust issue there for Labour to rebuild.
Do you think that this is part of the conversation we were having earlier about when people come into government, and I know I'm going to sound like Donald Trump a little bit here, but they don't have any real business experience. So they're coming in trying to run what is essentially a very large public company, and they've never run anything.
Although he has run the CPS, so maybe in that way he is a bit different. And he also became an MP in his 50s, which is quite different to some of the other people who are around the table.
Like Cameron, who became an MP in his 20s.
Cameron or Rachel Reeves, or these people who are more like steeped in Westminster politics. But he really isn't.
But do you think that some of it, and this isn't just about Starmer, but do you think that some of it is that they spend all of their lives in certain spheres, and they don't think too much about these contexts that they're not familiar with? They don't think too much about Ukraine and Russia and China and the Middle East. They're worried more about their constituents and the domestic politics. And then suddenly they get thrust into the spotlight, particularly the people who are given these positions by Starmer or any other prime minister. They're given this brief, you're now foreign secretary, you're now this. And they don't know much about it. They're having to cram overnight.
Yeah, I mean, I always think they should have a better HR system to try and actually work out who's actually got the experience in this area to be the minister in this area.
Right.
And obviously it's better if they can do that. Obviously a lot of the shadow cabinet became the cabinet, so people had experience in those areas. But because Labour have been out of power for 14 years, what you didn't have is loads of people with cabinet experience.
Yes.
In fact, only Yvette Cooper, maybe Ed Miliband.
I wanted to talk about something a little bit lighter, because you told me that MPs really like WhatsApp and they really hate email.
Yeah.
So you communicate with most of these people via WhatsApp?
Yeah, because I was trying to say when Laura Kuenssberg accidentally sent her notes to Boris Johnson, I was convinced she must have done it over WhatsApp rather than email.
It's very difficult.
Because basically MPs largely have an email address that someone else looks through. So it will go to their office. So I don't even, sometimes when I email an MP, I don't even say, dear so-and-so, I just say, oh, by the way, I've been talking to so-and-so, can you help to say, it's more like...
You say, I've been talking to Keir Starmer, and it's someone else, obviously not Keir Starmer.
I haven't got, unfortunately, a straight email line into Keir, but everybody uses WhatsApp, and it's just like, so I imagine that, and when I was doing the Keir and Rishi documentaries, and I was actually saying Keir Starmer's changed his number, and clearly at some point I've been on the get off that list, but I'd have had his number in the past, and I did have Rishi Sunak's. And every time I went to send something to the Rishi group or the Keir group that I'd set up for these documentaries, their numbers would come up, and I'd always be like, am I accidentally going to WhatsApp them? But yeah, it feels like that. And not only do people use WhatsApp, lots of people now put on deleting messages.
Oh, yeah.
Which is really frustrating because someone sends you something that maybe it's an invitation or something, and by the time you look back at it, it's gone.
I've started to do that as well, actually. I think it's probably a good idea, actually. But so now in your phone, who is the most high-profile person you have in your phone now?
Well, I've got most of the cabinet probably.
Okay.
Apart from Keir Starmer. Well, I've got Keir's old number.
But do you have Obama? So.
I do not. I only met Barack Obama once, and it was amazing. I was 2006, and I went to do a 4-month placement at the Washington Post, which one British journalist does every year.
Yeah.
And they were like two things that were really quite exciting. One they said, would you mind going on Air Force One with the then President George W. Bush? Yeah,
that was a while ago.
This is aging me now, yeah. And we travelled to a couple of places in America, which was really exciting because because I was for the Washington Post, we had to do almost like you had to write a kind of diary note or a PA type note for everyone else. So you'd have to be like, wheels up, 10:02, and then kind of take you through it bit by bit. And I was very like kind of green and 26 years old and totally out of my depth, but it was really fun. But then on another occasion they said to me, oh, there's this really exciting up-and-coming senator, Barack Obama. Would you mind going and meeting him at this thing? And of course he wasn't actually running for president by then in 2006. So yeah, I went to meet him, I got to interview him for a bit, and my big shameful story is I forgot to press record on my dictaphone, and later I had to ask a member of staff who worked for him if they could send me a recording so that I could write the story for the Washington Post.
And when you met him, did you think this guy's really charismatic?
Definitely. And in fact, I wrote about how there were queues round the corner to try and see him, and how I wrote a blog when I came back about how meeting this guy, Barack Obama, was more exciting than going on Air Force One. Okay. So definitely he was like totally, I mean, talk about charisma. He is a very charismatic guy.
Even at that point, like before the power.
Yeah.
And the,
I mean, he must have, because that was 2006, so he must have...
He'd written his book by then, so that was probably why people were following him.
But he must have said he was running quite soon after that, because he becomes president in 2008.
I want to come to the audience in a second, so think about if you have questions. But this freebie scandal, I want to think about it a little bit. I mean, is it such a problem for Starmer to accept these gifts, glasses, suits? I mean, he's got to wear something.
It's just a really bad look. I mean, the reason he has found this difficult is because to him it's all about the rules. He's the lawyer, yeah?
Right.
It's the rules. To him, Boris Johnson broke the rules. Taking loads of freebies didn't break the rules. It was within the rules. But that's
the optics of it.
How it looks.
Yeah.
You took £107,000 worth of freebies. The next biggest one was 40,000. Like, what does that look like? You know, they could have had a fund in the Labour Party to pay for their clothes, and nobody would have said anything. But instead, on the list, $2,500 on his glasses. I mean, I don't know about you, but every time I look at Keir Starmer, I'm looking at his glasses going, where did you get them from?
Yeah.
They can't be worth that much,
No,
can
exactly,
they?
yeah.
And also, like, I don't know, kind of standing on the edge of a sports pitch the other week watching my kids, all the parents were talking about it, and they don't really talk about politics.
That's what they call cut-through.
Cut-through.
Yeah.
It definitely has cut-through. I think in the end, they've got 5 years, not 5 months, And in the end, the freebie scandal itself will probably be long forgotten. But what will be hard to rebuild is the trust loss that they've had as a result of it.
Let's go to the audience. Tam, do we have the microphone? We'll take a few and then you can choose. The gentleman here and then the lady over here.
Sorry, hello. When you talk about, I guess, the loss of trust, I mean, I'm from the States, so now here. I mean, the loss of trust in politics has been going on probably 2 or 3 times my own lifespan. And you think about, that is probably started a little bit later here, but it's very much a decades-long phenomenon. I mean, when I was looking at election coverage and watching it, there was not a whole lot of enthusiasm for Keir Starmer or Labour, really, to begin with. A lot of people talk about the Loveless Landslide. So to what extent is the trust not really lost? It was just never there to begin with.
Good, nice.
Well, the lack of enthusiasm for Labour is obviously true. And what happened in the election, and I try and sort of look at this, I think both things are true. I think that the Tories suffered a catastrophic loss in trust, and it was a loss for them, this election, in every way, to Labour, to Reform, to the Lib Dems, to the Greens, but also, and to the SNP? No, not to the SNP, because they also, another party of government that got hammered, and in fact the DUP got hammered as well, and that, one of my, I went into the exit poll process or just outside it early at 7 p.m. and got briefed early, and my colleague who was getting the data said this might be the FU, I won't use the word, but the FU election, because every single party in power was getting absolutely hammered. But I sort of both think there was a lack of enthusiasm for Labour, but also they strategically did really well in that election. And I always said this to Conservative MPs who used to get really excited about how unenthusiastic people were about Keir Starmer. It doesn't matter if they're unenthusiastic about Keir Starmer. All that matters is, are they going to accept him as Prime Minister? Are they scared of him or not? And if they're not, they're going to stay at home and they're not going to vote for you, and that's going to be a problem. And even though Tony Blair, obviously, patently got more enthusiasm, more people voted for John Major, the Conservative leader in 1992, than voted for Tony Blair in 1997. One of the things that contributed to Tony Blair's landslide was 3 million Tories staying at home. And these things are active decisions. What I don't accept is that, therefore Keir Starmer just sort of gets carried to power. This is all quite active stuff that actually happens. It's
a version of what, in the US they call double haters, like the people who hate Trump and the people who hate Kamala or Biden. And it's just which of those two groups are going to stay home more.
Yeah, and also then you've got the Reform UK phenomenon, which I think was a huge, huge impact in this election. And it handed Keir Starmer a majority of 170 plus. It would have been a majority of 80 if it hadn't have been for the Reform surge. And that's if only half of Reform, or if only a third of Reform voters had gone back to the Tories, 60 of their MPs would have survived instantly. Now, all that said, when Keir Starmer got into power, suddenly he's the Prime Minister. You know what we were saying about David Cameron? Yeah. Suddenly he's not this boring opposition figure or ruthless opposition figure or whatever you see him as. Suddenly he's the Prime Minister, and you get treated differently and seen differently, and he had an opportunity to build trust. And actually, I think people would say he did quite well with that during the riots. And actually, I think some of the language around the riots has been really, really positive. I was really impressed in the conference speech about the way he talked about the far right, about the way he wasn't going to listen to people's concerns or conflate what was basically far right racism and abuse with concerns about immigration. I think all of that was and is quite positive. I just think all these other things have had a drastic impact on trust, and did they need to all happen? Probably not.
Let's keep going.
Obviously they won a landslide in the recent election, and we've spoken about some of the issues that they've had to deal with at the get-go, from the get-go rather, and yet they have so much legislative power. Why does it seem like the administration is kind of paralyzed on quite a few key issues, like the budget, for instance?
Okay, I think we've got the gist of the question. Yeah. Why do you think they are? Do you think they are paralyzed? Or?
Definitely. I think one of the biggest problems was they took so long to get to the budget, and at this moment in time, the budget is going to frame everything, and they've left far too long and far too big a vacuum between coming into power. They always had to wait for the OBR to do its work, but they could have instantly, when they came in, said we're going to have a budget in September, and started the OBR process immediately. and that would have taken a lot of the other focus away, because what happens in that time is people are looking for stories, they're going to break stories. That
They're looking to define the government in some way, right?
I think they look at 2010 when the Tories really successfully blamed Labour for crashing for the financial crisis, and they think we have to do the same. And apparently it took until 2012, 2013 for it to get into people's psyche that Labour were to blame for the financial crisis, and that's one of the reasons David Cameron wins in 2015. The difference is, in 2010, we had a hung parliament. Labour didn't lose the election. It was really close. There was a whole narrative of Gordon Brown had saved the world. I think there was a debate to be had, and I actually think it was dishonest what the Tories did, saying that it was Labour's fault when clearly it wasn't Labour's fault.
Good politics,
in 2024, is there any doubt from that election result that people had rejected the Tories and blamed the Tories already? So my question to them repeatedly is, do you need to go this hard on the inheritance when people are already blaming the Conservative government and actually want to have something much more hopeful from you?
Okay, well, I mean, I'll have a couple more questions and we'll end. But I have to ask you this because our colleague Lydia Wilson is from Hull, and she's very proud of being from Hull. And so she's very upset that she's not here because you're from Scunthorpe.
I was born in Scunthorpe.
And so she has this thing, she wrote to me about it. She said, you know, I miss being there because I won't be able to bond with Anushka over the fact that you're both technically from a county, Humberside, which now no longer exists.
Does not exist.
Yeah.
No.
So we'll just do like a minute of the little bonding for Lydia's sake. But there's a serious part to that, which is that I imagine you go to Scunthorpe or you go
I actually grew up in a place called Staley Bridge in northwest England, but I spent 2 years in Scunthorpe before that.
But you go back to other parts of the country outside of the Beltway, so to speak.
Yeah.
Do you think that gives you a better view of the politics of the country? Because sometimes...
Massively so. And also, like, basically, my whole passion and drive is that you do not spend all your time reporting from Westminster. You get on the road, you listen to people, you then take what those people are saying and you can put it to Prime Ministers. So yeah, I'm from really from Staley Bridge, which is in the northwest near Manchester, old industrial town, just about votes Labour. Now it's bigger, but you know, it's sort of quite red wally basically. And I always remember, like, my neighbour Hazel, I always ask her what she thinks because she'll tell me what's right and what's wrong. And, you know, she was like, fortnightly bin collections, that's what we care about. Quite a long time before the media were talking about fortnightly bin collections. And I remember saying to my editor, I'm telling you now, we need to start doing stuff on fortnightly bin collections. And you just like, the other person who is my mum, I always like, does my mum care about this? And if she doesn't, then maybe I've gone wrong somewhere here. Or how do I sell this story in a way that my mum would care about it?
Right.
But like, you know, just to give you an example, in the cost of living crisis, I spent a lot of time in different parts of the country meeting people, listening to them. I remember meeting a pub owner in Cleckheaton in Yorkshire who literally broke down crying to me because of the increase in his energy bills. And then next minute, I'm at the top of the Empire State Building interviewing Liz Truss, and I'm like, Steve from Cleckheaton has said this. What's your answer to it? And that is the privilege of my job. But it has to be that the stories are coming from Steve and Cleckheaton or whoever it is, and not from what some bubble in Westminster thinks about it.
Right. Well, I think on that note, we will end it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out. Hold the applause for one moment. I just have a couple of things to tell you. The first is that Anushka's book, Taken as Read, is in all bookstores now. We will be back here on November 15th. Those of you who haven't been to our events before, I hope you'll sign up and come and see us again. So that's it. Thank you all for coming out, and thank you, Anushka Asthana, for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. No.